She was dumped by her millionaire CEO Groom on their wedding day for his mistress. Now she's the banking director who must approve the emergency loan to save his collapsing empire. Please, Evelyn. I'm begging you. If you don't sign this, I'll lose everything. Everything? You mean like how I lost everything when you left me standing at the altar in front of 400 people? Like how I lost everything when you chose her over me 6 hours before our wedding. That was different, and you know it. Different? No, Ryan. What's different is that now I have the power. Now you're the one who needs me. And honestly, it feels incredible. Imagine the man who shattered your heart on what should have been the happiest day of your life, now sitting across from you, trembling, begging for your mercy. Have you ever fantasized about having complete power over someone who destroyed you? What would you do when the person who chose someone else over you desperately needs you to save them from losing everything? Will she crush him like he crushed her? Or will she discover that revenge isn't as sweet as she imagined? This story will blow your mind. 3 years ago, Ryan Mitchell was a tech billionaire worth $300 million. 3 years ago, Evelyn Cross was standing in a wedding dress, believing in forever. Today, their roles have completely reversed. She's the director of corporate lending at Manhattan's most powerful bank, and he's a broken man whose empire is crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But this isn't just a story about revenge. This is a story about what happens when the universe gives you exactly what you thought you wanted, and you realize it might not be what you needed at all. The 42nd floor of First National Bank offered commanding views of Manhattan's financial district, where billions of dollars flowed like rivers of liquid power. From her corner office, Evelyn Cross surveyed the city below like a queen overlooking her kingdom. At 31, she had climbed higher and faster than anyone expected in the male-dominated world of corporate banking. Her office was a testament to her success. Floor-to-ceiling windows, original artwork, and a desk that had once belonged to one of America's most famous financiers. But the most important thing in this room wasn't the expensive furniture or the prestigious view. It was the stack of loan applications on her desk, each one representing someone's dreams, someone's future, someone's desperate hope for survival. Today, one of those applications would change everything. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, hit that like button right now. This story is about to take you on an emotional roller coaster that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love, forgiveness, and second chances. The intercom buzzed, cutting through her thoughts. Mrs. Cross, the Mitchell Enterprises delegation has arrived for the emergency loan review. Mitchell Enterprises, the name that had haunted her dreams and fueled her ambitions for 3 long years. She'd built her entire career on the foundation of that betrayal, transforming her heartbreak into an unstoppable drive for success. Now, the company owned by the man who had destroyed her faith in love was facing bankruptcy, and she was the only person who could save it. "Send them to conference room A," she replied, her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions swirling in her chest. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." 5 minutes to prepare for the confrontation she'd been both dreading and anticipating since the moment she'd seen his signature on the loan application. 5 minutes to steel herself for seeing the face that had once meant everything to her, and now meant nothing but painful memories. But first, she needed to remember exactly how this war had started. St. Patrick's Cathedral, June 15th, 3 years ago. The day that was supposed to be the beginning of her happily ever after became the day her world ended in the most public, humiliating way possible. She'd been in the bridal suite, adjusting her grandmother's pearls one final time. The ivory silk dress had cost more than most people made in a year, and she'd felt like a princess about to step into her fairy tale. Outside, 400 guests were seated in the pews, waiting to witness the union of two people who'd built their love story from college sweethearts to business partners to soulmates. "Evelyn, sweetheart, we need to talk." Jennifer, her maid of honor, had walked into the room with tears streaming down her face and a phone clutched in her trembling hand. "What's wrong? Is Ryan hurt? Did something happen to his family?" "He's gone, Evelyn. Ryan left for Vegas 2 hours ago. With Scarlett." The words hadn't made sense. Ryan Mitchell, the man who'd proposed to her in Central Park with a ring he'd saved for 2 years to afford. Ryan, who'd spent the previous evening telling her how excited he was to wake up as her husband. Ryan, who'd held her face in his hands just 12 hours earlier and whispered that she was his everything. That's impossible. There has to be some mistake. But there was no mistake. While she was getting her hair done and dreaming about their honeymoon in Tuscany, Ryan was boarding a plane to Nevada with his 24-year-old marketing director. While she was putting on the dress she'd spent months choosing, he was exchanging vows with another woman in a tacky chapel on the Las Vegas Strip. The church had to be cleared. The reception had to be canceled. 400 guests had to be told that there would be no wedding because the groom had decided, 6 hours before the ceremony, that he loved someone else more. But that humiliation, that public devastation, had forged her into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. She'd taken her broken heart and transformed it into an empire of her own. While Ryan was playing house with his new wife, Evelyn was conquering the banking world one deal at a time. Now, 3 years later, the universe was offering her the ultimate revenge. Ryan's company was dying, and she was the only doctor who could save it. Or let it die. She stood up from her desk, smoothed her charcoal gray blazer, and checked her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was polished, powerful, and absolutely ruthless. Ryan Mitchell was about to learn what happened when you underestimated Evelyn Cross. Conference room A was designed to intimidate. The massive oak table could seat 20 people, and the walls were covered with portraits of banking legends who'd built fortunes and destroyed enemies with equal efficiency. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, a constant reminder that in this room, empires were built and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. 3 men were already seated when she entered. She recognized Ryan immediately, though he looked like a shadow of the confident entrepreneur she'd once known. His dark hair was shorter now, his expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, and his eyes held a desperation that was almost palpable. "Gentlemen," Evelyn said, taking her seat at the head of the table like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "I've reviewed your application. Let's see if you can convince me that your company deserves to survive." Ryan looked up at her, and for a moment, she saw a flash of the boy she'd fallen in love with in college. "Evelyn, It's Mrs. Cross," she interrupted, her voice cold enough to freeze blood. "And you're here as a supplicant, Mr. Mitchell. I suggest you remember that." The 2 other men shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension crackling between their boss and the woman who held their company's fate in her hands. This wasn't going to be a normal business meeting. This was going to be a reckoning. And Evelyn Cross was ready for war. The silence in conference room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his briefcase, the small movement catching Evelyn's attention despite her attempt to remain detached. 3 years ago, those same hands had traced her face on lazy Sunday mornings, had held her close during thunderstorms, had shaken as he'd placed an engagement ring on her finger. Now they shook for entirely different reasons. "Mrs. Cross," Lucas Thompson began, his voice carefully modulated to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Thank you for agreeing to review our emergency loan application on such short notice. We understand the irregular nature of this request." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, studying the 3 men across from her like a predator evaluating potential prey. Lucas was younger than Ryan, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of eager intelligence that reminded her of herself at that age. Jack Anderson, the legal counsel, was older, more seasoned, his gray hair and expensive suit suggesting years of high-stakes negotiations. But it was Ryan who commanded her attention, even as she tried to focus on the business at hand. He sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his green eyes fixed on the documents spread across the table. The confident man who'd once commanded boardrooms with charismatic ease was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "The nature of your request isn't what concerns me, Mr. Thompson," Evelyn replied, opening the thick folder in front of her. "It's the numbers behind it." She spread financial statements across the polished oak surface, each document telling a story of systematic failure. Revenue projections that had missed their marks by stunning margins. Investment decisions that had backfired spectacularly. A company that had once been the darling of the tech world was now a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. "Your company's performance over the past 18 months reads like a textbook case of corporate mismanagement," she continued, her voice clinical and precise. "Revenue down 42%. Market share declining in every sector. Your primary competitors have captured the clients you've lost through what can only be described as strategic incompetence. Lucas shifted in his seat, his prepared talking points clearly derailed by Evelyn's brutal assessment. Mrs. Cross, while it's true that we've faced some challenges, the fundamentals of our business remain strong. Our technology is cutting edge, our talent pool is exceptional, and our market position, while temporarily weakened, is far from irreparable. Temporarily weakened? Evelyn's eyebrows arched in what might have been amusement if there had been any warmth in her expression. Mr. Thompson, your company is hemorrhaging money at a rate that would make a Vegas casino blush. The Riverside development alone cost you $30 million with absolutely nothing to show for it, except a half-built foundation and a lawsuit that threatens to bankrupt what's left of your operations. She turned her attention to Jack Anderson, whose carefully neutral expression suggested he was already calculating the legal ramifications of the company's inevitable collapse. And then there's the Phoenix hotel acquisition. Care to explain how purchasing a failing hotel chain for $60 million was supposed to strengthen your tech company's core business? Jack cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot. The acquisition was part of a diversification strategy designed to reduce our dependence on the volatile tech sector. The hospitality industry offered opportunities for implementing our software solutions in real-world applications. In other words, you threw good money after bad in markets you didn't understand. Evelyn translated coldly. The result? You're now the proud owners of 7 hotels that are losing money faster than they can change sheets, and your core technology business has suffered from neglect while management focused on playing hotel moguls. She could see Ryan's hands clenching into fists, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of his suit. The old Ryan would have defended his decisions passionately, would have painted a picture of visionary leadership and calculated risks. This Ryan sat in silence, apparently recognizing that his track record spoke louder than any excuses he might offer. But perhaps my favorite example of your company's strategic brilliance, Evelyn continued, pulling out another set of documents, is the overseas expansion into emerging markets. Investing $40 million in countries with unstable currencies and uncertain regulatory environments. Did anyone in your organization conduct even basic due diligence on these markets? Lucas's face flushed red. The emerging market strategy was based on extensive research and projected growth patterns that indicated significant opportunities for early movers in those regions. Research that failed to account for political instability, currency devaluation, and regulatory changes that wiped out your entire investment within 8 months, Evelyn countered. I've seen more sophisticated business planning from college freshmen in introductory economics courses. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ryan's jaw worked silently, and she could see the muscle ticking in his cheek, a telltale sign of the barely controlled anger she remembered from their college days. But he remained silent, allowing his subordinates to field her attacks while he absorbed each blow like a boxer taking punishment in the late rounds of a fight he'd already lost. Drop a comment below if you think she should approve or deny this loan. The decision she makes will change everything. Mr. Mitchell, Evelyn said, finally addressing him directly. You've been unusually quiet during this presentation. Don't you want to defend your company's record? Ryan looked up at her for the first time since the meeting began, and the intensity in his green eyes nearly took her breath away. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls around her heart trembled, memories threatening to flood back despite her determination to keep them at bay. What would be the point? He asked quietly. You've clearly made up your mind about our competence based on the numbers. And honestly, Mrs. Cross, the numbers don't lie. It was such a departure from the Ryan she remembered that Evelyn found herself momentarily speechless. The man she'd known had never admitted defeat, never conceded an argument, never acknowledged failure without immediately pivoting to how he was going to fix it. This quiet acceptance of responsibility was something entirely new. The numbers certainly don't lie, she agreed, recovering her composure. They tell a story of a company that's been taking calculated risks that turned into calculated disasters. Isn't that what you used to call them? Calculated risks. The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with personal history that the other men in the room couldn't possibly understand. It had been Ryan's favorite expression during their college years, his justification for every ambitious plan and bold decision. Starting their first business together had been a calculated risk. Dropping out of graduate school to focus on their startup had been a calculated risk. Even proposing to her in Central Park, 2 years before he'd saved enough for the ring he thought she deserved, had been a calculated risk. She watched the recognition dawn in his eyes, saw him understand that she wasn't just attacking his business decisions, but revisiting the choices that had defined their relationship. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the weight of their shared history was pressing down on everyone present. "Yes," Ryan said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to call them calculated risks. I was wrong about a lot of things back then." The admission hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't the cocky entrepreneur who'd convinced her to risk everything on their shared dreams. This wasn't the man who'd swept her off her feet with grand gestures and bigger promises. This was someone who'd been broken by the consequences of his own choices, humbled by failure in ways she'd never seen before. Lucas jumped into the silence, clearly sensing that the conversation had veered into territory that had nothing to do with loan applications and everything to do with whatever history existed between his boss and the woman who held their company's fate in her hands. "Mrs. Cross, if I may redirect our discussion to the specific terms of our funding request," he said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional decorum. "We're seeking $75 million in emergency funding to stabilize operations and implement a comprehensive restructuring plan. Our projections show a clear path to profitability within 24 months. Evelyn forced herself to look away from Ryan and focus on Lucas's presentation, though her mind was reeling from the brief exchange. She'd expected arrogance, excuses, perhaps even charm as Ryan tried to manipulate her emotions. She hadn't expected quiet defeat and what seemed like genuine remorse. "Your projections," she said, flipping through the documents, "are based on assumptions that seem wildly optimistic given your company's recent performance. You're projecting revenue growth of 30% in year 1 and 50% in year 2. What concrete evidence do you have that such growth is achievable?" Jack Anderson leaned forward, pulling out a tablet and sliding it across the table. "Mrs. Cross, our restructuring plan includes workforce optimization, asset divestiture, and a refocus on our core technology competencies. We've identified specific cost savings that will immediately improve our operational efficiency." "Workforce optimization," Evelyn repeated flatly. "You mean layoffs?" "Strategic personnel adjustments designed to align our human resources with our revised business objectives," Jack corrected, though his discomfort with the euphemism was obvious. "How many people will lose their jobs if this loan is approved?" Lucas and Jack exchanged glances, clearly hoping Ryan would field this question. When he remained silent, Lucas reluctantly answered. "Approximately 60 employees would be affected by the restructuring." 60 families, Evelyn clarified. 60 people who trusted your company to provide stable employment, who are now facing unemployment because of management decisions they had no part in making. "It's not a decision we take lightly," Jack said defensively. "But without significant restructuring, the entire company will collapse, and all 200 employees will lose their jobs." Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mrs. Cross, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have an urgent call from the Federal Reserve on line 1. Evelyn glanced at the clock on the conference room wall. They'd been at this for nearly an hour, and she could feel the emotional strain wearing on everyone in the room. The call provided a welcome break from the intensity of the confrontation. "Gentlemen, I need to take this call. We'll resume in 10 minutes. As she stood to leave, Ryan spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "Evelyn." She turned back, one hand on the door handle. "Mrs. Cross." "Mrs. Cross," he corrected himself, the formal address seeming to cause him physical pain. "Those 60 employees you mentioned, they're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're people I know, people whose children I've met at company picnics, people who've trusted me to make the right decisions for this company." The vulnerability in his voice was like a crack in her carefully maintained armor. For just a moment, she saw past the failed businessman to the man who'd once cared more about people than profit, who'd started their first company because he wanted to create something meaningful. "Then you should have thought of that before you drove the company into the ground," she replied, but her voice lacked the ice it had carried throughout the meeting. She walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with military precision. But as the door closed behind her, she found herself thinking not about loan applications and financial projections, but about the man who'd just admitted that his employees weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. The same man who'd once told her that people always came first, right before he'd chosen someone else over her. The call from the Federal Reserve had been routine, but it gave Evelyn the breathing room she desperately needed. Standing in her office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, she tried to process what had just happened in that conference room. The Ryan she'd expected to face had been replaced by someone she'd barely recognized. Gone was the arrogant entrepreneur who'd once believed he could conquer the world through sheer force of will. In his place sat a man who seemed genuinely haunted by the consequences of his choices. She returned to her desk and pulled out the Mitchell Enterprises file, spreading the documents across the polished surface. If she was going to make a decision about this loan, she needed to understand exactly what had happened to Ryan's company. The public failures were obvious, but something nagged at her about the financial records. There were discrepancies that didn't quite add up, patterns that suggested a more complex story than simple mismanagement. The first anomaly she noticed was buried deep in the quarterly expense reports. Despite the company's declining revenues, Mitchell Enterprises had maintained remarkably high spending in several categories that seemed unrelated to their core business operations. Employee benefits remained at premium levels even as other expenses were slashed. The company had continued funding something called the Mitchell Foundation to the tune of $2 million per quarter, even as they hemorrhaged money elsewhere. Curious, Evelyn pulled up the foundation's records on her computer. What she found made her pause. The Mitchell Foundation wasn't some vanity project designed to boost Ryan's public image. It was funding scholarships for underprivileged students in computer science and engineering programs across the country. The foundation had put over 300 students through college in the past 3 years, with many of them going on to work for major tech companies. She dug deeper into the expense reports, following financial threads that painted an increasingly complex picture. There were payments to medical facilities that had no apparent connection to the company's business operations. When she cross-referenced these payments with employee records, a pattern emerged that left her speechless. Ryan's company had quietly been paying medical expenses for employees and their families. Cancer treatments for a programmer's wife. Surgery for a designer's child. Physical therapy for an accountant injured in a car accident. The amounts were staggering, easily running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per case. And none of it was publicly disclosed or used for publicity purposes. There were other discoveries. Emergency housing assistance for employees facing eviction. Interest-free loans for staff members trying to buy their first homes. A child care center on the company premises that operated at a significant loss but allowed working parents to keep their children close. The more she investigated, the more she realized that Ryan's company wasn't just bleeding money due to bad investments. It was hemorrhaging cash because its CEO couldn't say no to people in need. The spreadsheet in front of her told a story that contradicted everything she thought she knew about Mitchell Enterprises' financial troubles. Yes, there had been terrible business decisions and failed ventures. But there had also been a systematic effort to take care of people, even when doing so threatened the company's survival. She was so absorbed in her analysis that she didn't notice her office door opening until her brother Michael's voice cut through her concentration. "Working late again, I see." Evelyn looked up to find Michael Cross standing in her doorway, still wearing his courtroom attire from what had obviously been a long day. At 35, her older brother had built a reputation as one of Manhattan's most formidable attorneys, specializing in corporate law and mergers. His presence in her office meant he'd heard about the Mitchell Enterprises meeting through the Wall Street gossip network that kept the financial district's elite informed about each other's business. "The meeting with Ryan went that well, huh?" Michael said, settling into the chair across from her desk without waiting for an invitation. "It's a loan application review, Michael. Nothing more. Right? And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that you've been staring at those financial documents for the past 2 hours with the same expression you wore when you found out about his Vegas wedding." Evelyn set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. Michael was the only person who'd seen her at her absolute worst after Ryan's betrayal. He'd been the one to find her crying in her apartment 3 days after the non-wedding, surrounded by returned gifts and crumpled tissues. He'd been the one to convince her to channel her pain into ambition, to use Ryan's abandonment as fuel for her own success. He's different, she admitted quietly. I expected arrogance, maybe some attempt to charm his way into my good graces. Instead, he sat there and took every criticism I threw at him without defending himself. Maybe because he knows he deserves it. Maybe. Or maybe there's more to this story than I realized. She gestured to the documents spread across her desk. Did you know that his company has been quietly funding medical expenses for employees and their families? Cancer treatments, surgeries, emergency care. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars per case, Michael. Money they clearly couldn't afford to spend. Michael frowned, leaning forward to examine the financial records. As a corporate attorney, he'd seen plenty of companies try to buy employee loyalty with generous benefits packages. But this was different. The scale and scope of Mitchell Enterprises' employee support went far beyond standard corporate benefits. This is unusual, he admitted. Most companies would have cut these expenses first when facing financial difficulties. The fact that Ryan maintained them even as his business collapsed suggests either incredible stupidity or genuine care for his people. That's what I can't figure out. The Ryan I knew was ambitious, sometimes ruthlessly so, but he was never stupid. So why would he continue these payments when they were clearly contributing to the company's financial problems? Maybe because the Ryan you knew wasn't the real Ryan, Michael suggested gently. Maybe the man who left you at the altar was acting out of character, and this is who he really is. The possibility hung between them, challenging everything Evelyn had believed about Ryan's motivations and character. She'd spent 3 years convinced that his betrayal revealed his true nature, that his promises of love and partnership had been lies designed to manipulate her. But the evidence in front of her suggested a man who put people before profit, even when doing so threatened his own survival. I don't know what to think anymore, she said finally. Part of me wants to deny this loan just to watch him fail. But another part of me wonders if I'm missing something important. Michael reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. Whatever you decide, make sure it's based on the facts, not on old wounds. You're too good at your job to let personal history cloud your professional judgment. Before Evelyn could respond, her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom with an announcement that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Cross, there's a Scarlett Reynolds here to see you. She says it's urgent and personal. Evelyn's heart stopped. Scarlett Reynolds. The woman who'd stolen her fiancé, who'd convinced Ryan to abandon their wedding for a spontaneous elopement in Vegas. The last person on earth she expected to see in her office, especially on the same day she was reviewing Ryan's loan application. Should I send her away? Her assistant asked when Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Michael raised his eyebrows, clearly recognizing the name and understanding its significance. He started to stand, obviously intending to leave, but Evelyn gestured for him to stay. Whatever Scarlett wanted to say, Evelyn suspected she might need moral support. Send her in, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Scarlett Reynolds entered the office looking nothing like the confident young woman who'd appeared in the wedding photos that had splashed across the society pages 3 years ago. Her red hair was shorter now, her designer clothes couldn't hide the weight she'd lost, and there was a nervousness in her manner that suggested this visit wasn't easy for her either. Evelyn, she said softly, stopping just inside the door. Thank you for seeing me. I know this must be difficult. What do you want, Scarlett? I need to tell you something about Ryan. About our marriage. About why he really left you. The words hit Evelyn like physical blows. She'd spent 3 years trying to forget the details of Ryan's betrayal, trying not to think about his life with the woman he'd chosen over her. The last thing she wanted was to hear about their marriage from Scarlett herself. I don't think that's any of my business, she said coldly. Actually, it is. Because our marriage was a mistake from the very beginning, and it's important that you understand why Ryan made the choices he did. Scarlett moved closer to the desk, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. Ryan and I divorced 18 months ago. The marriage lasted less than 2 years because we both realized we'd made a terrible mistake. Subscribe if you want to see how this incredible story unfolds. The truth behind this betrayal is about to change everything. The revelation hit Evelyn like a thunderbolt. Divorced. Ryan and Scarlett were divorced and had been for over a year. The perfect couple whose whirlwind romance had destroyed her faith in love had fallen apart almost as quickly as it had begun. Why should I care about your marital problems? Evelyn asked, though her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she did care, more than she wanted to admit. Because Ryan never loved me, Scarlett said quietly. He was running from something when he left you. Something that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own fears. I was just the escape route he used to avoid facing the truth about himself. Michael shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable being present for such an intimate conversation. But Evelyn was grateful for his presence. She needed an anchor in this moment, someone to keep her grounded as her understanding of the past 3 years began to crumble. What truth? She heard herself ask. That he was terrified of becoming his father. That he was so afraid of turning into the kind of man who put business before family that he destroyed the most important relationship in his life to prove he wasn't that person. The explanation was so unexpected, so different from anything Evelyn had imagined, that she found herself speechless. She'd assumed Ryan left because he'd fallen in love with someone else, because Scarlett offered him something she couldn't provide. The possibility that his abandonment had been motivated by fear rather than love had never occurred to her. "You're saying he left me to prove he wasn't like his father?" she asked incredulously. "I'm saying he left you because he was already like his father, and he couldn't face that reality. He was working 18-hour days, missing dinners, canceling plans because of business emergencies. He was becoming the kind of man who loved his company more than his family, and it terrified him." Scarlett's words painted a picture that was beginning to make terrible sense. Robert Mitchell had been a distant, cold man who treated his family like business obligations rather than people he loved. Ryan had grown up watching his mother cry alone while his father conquered the business world, and he'd sworn he would never become that kind of man. "So he ran away with you." "He ran away with the idea of me," Scarlett corrected. "The idea that choosing passion over responsibility proved he wasn't turning into his father. But all he really proved was that he was capable of hurting the people he loved most." Evelyn sat in stunned silence, trying to process this new information. Everything she believed about Ryan's betrayal was being turned upside down. The man she'd hated for 3 years might have been motivated not by selfishness or cruelty, but by a misguided attempt to protect her from the person he was afraid he was becoming. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally. "Because Ryan's company is dying, and I know you're the one reviewing his loan application. Because he spent the last 18 months trying to become the man he should have been for you. Because he deserves a chance to make things right, even if it's too late for the two of you." The office fell silent except for the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic 42 floors below. Evelyn stared at the financial documents spread across her desk, seeing them now in an entirely different light. The charitable giving, the employee support, the refusal to cut benefits even as the company faced bankruptcy. It all painted a picture of a man trying to prove that people mattered more than profit, that he wasn't the cold businessman his father had been. But was it enough? Could understanding Ryan's motivations erase 3 years of pain and humiliation? And more importantly, did it change her professional obligation to make the right decision about his loan application? As Scarlett quietly left her office and Michael prepared to follow, Evelyn realized that the simple loan review she'd expected to conduct had become something far more complex. The numbers on the spreadsheets told one story, but the truth behind those numbers revealed a man she'd thought she knew but apparently never understood at all. The question now was whether that truth changed anything, or whether it was simply too late for understanding to matter. After Scarlett left, Evelyn sat in her office, staring at the closed door, her mind reeling from revelations that challenged everything she'd believed about her past. Michael remained in his chair, watching her with the concerned expression of someone who'd just witnessed his sister's world being turned upside down. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "I thought I understood what happened 3 years ago. Ryan fell in love with someone else and chose her over me. It was simple, brutal, but at least it made sense. This changes everything." "Does it though?" Michael leaned forward. "Even if his motivations were different than you thought, the result was the same. He still left you at the altar. He still humiliated you in front of 400 people. Good intentions don't erase the damage he caused." Evelyn knew her brother was right, but something Scarlett had said kept echoing in her mind. Ryan had been terrified of becoming like his father. The more she thought about it, the more pieces of their relationship began to fall into place in ways she'd never considered before. Robert Mitchell had been a legend in the business world, but a failure as a father and husband. Evelyn remembered the few times she'd met Ryan's parents during college. His mother, Patricia, had been elegant and well-spoken, but there had been a sadness in her eyes that seemed permanently etched there. Robert had been polite but distant, treating even family gatherings like business meetings where efficiency mattered more than emotion. "I need to understand something," she said suddenly, reaching for her phone. "I need to know exactly what happened the week before our wedding." Michael watched as she scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she hadn't called in 3 years. Jennifer Walsh, her former maid of honor and Ryan's college friend, might have insights into his state of mind during those final days. "Jennifer? It's Evelyn. I know this is unexpected, but I need to ask you about something that happened right before my wedding was supposed to take place." "Evelyn, oh my God, I've thought about calling you so many times over the years. What do you need to know? Do you remember anything unusual about Ryan's behavior in the days leading up to the wedding? Anything that seemed off or concerning?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Actually, yes. I didn't think much of it at the time because everyone's stressed before their wedding, but Ryan called me 3 days before the ceremony. He was asking strange questions about your father." Evelyn's heart skipped. "My father? What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know how your dad balanced work and family when you were growing up. He kept asking if your father had ever missed important events because of business, if he'd ever put his career ahead of family time. I thought it was sweet that he was thinking about being a good husband and father someday." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Jennifer recounting details that painted a picture of a man tormented by fears Evelyn had never realized he carried. After hanging up, she sat in stunned silence as understanding began to dawn. "He was comparing himself to my father," she said to Michael. "Dad always made it to every school play, every soccer game, every family dinner. He built his accounting practice around our family schedule, not the other way around. Ryan was terrified he couldn't measure up." "That still doesn't justify what he did," Michael replied, though his tone had softened. "No, it doesn't. But it explains it." Evelyn's mind drifted back to their final months together, memories she tried to suppress flooding back with painful clarity. Ryan had been working increasingly long hours, missing dinners they'd planned, taking calls during their weekend getaways. She'd attributed it to pre-wedding stress and the pressure of growing his company, but now she wondered if there had been something deeper driving his behavior. She remembered one particular evening, 2 weeks before their wedding, when Ryan had arrived home at nearly midnight to find her asleep on the couch, still wearing the dress she'd put on for their dinner reservations. He'd woken her with gentle kisses, apologizing profusely for missing another date, promising to do better after the wedding when things settled down. "I don't want to become him," he'd whispered against her hair, holding her close in the darkness of their apartment. "Become who?" she'd asked sleepily. "No one. Just a bad dream." At the time, she'd assumed he was talking about some business competitor or former boss who'd served as a cautionary tale. Now she realized he'd been talking about his father, about the kind of man he was terrified of becoming. Her office phone rang, cutting through her memories. The caller ID showed Ryan's number, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something compelled her to answer. "Mrs. Cross." Ryan's voice sounded strained, exhausted. "I'm calling to inform you that Mitchell Enterprises is withdrawing our loan application, effective immediately." "What? What?" "Because I realized something sitting in that conference room today. I've put you in an impossible position, and that's not fair to you or to the bank. You shouldn't have to make a professional decision complicated by our personal history." Evelyn found herself gripping the phone tighter. "That's not your decision to make, Mr. Mitchell. The bank will complete its review process regardless of your concerns about my objectivity." "Evelyn, please. I know what I put you through 3 years ago. I know the pain I caused, the humiliation, the way I shattered your trust and love itself. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. I won't compound that damage by forcing you to choose between helping me and protecting yourself." The vulnerability in his voice was unlike anything she'd heard from him before. This wasn't the confident entrepreneur who'd once believed he could charm his way out of any situation. This was a man who'd been broken by the consequences of his choices and was trying to shield her from further pain. "You're withdrawing the application to protect me?" she asked incredulously. "I'm withdrawing it because it's the right thing to do. Because I should have done the right thing 3 years ago instead of running away like a coward." "Ryan, wait." But the line had gone dead. leaving Evelyn staring at her phone with a mixture of frustration and something that felt dangerously close to admiration. The old Ryan would never have walked away from $75 million, regardless of the personal cost to anyone else. This Ryan was sacrificing his company's survival to spare her from an awkward situation. Michael had been listening to her side of the conversation with growing concern. He withdrew the application to protect me from having to make a difficult decision, she said, still processing what had just happened. He's willing to let his company die rather than put me in an uncomfortable position. That's either incredibly noble or incredibly stupid. Maybe both. Evelyn stood and walked to her office windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline as the sun began to set behind the glass towers of the financial district. Somewhere out there, Ryan was probably sitting in his office, telling Lucas and Jack that their last hope for salvation had just been voluntarily surrendered. 200 employees would lose their jobs not because the bank had denied their loan, but because their CEO couldn't bear to cause his ex-fiancée any more pain. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, Ryan had made a devastating choice to protect her from the man he was afraid he was becoming. Today, he'd made another choice to protect her from the consequences of his past decisions. In both cases, his attempts to shield her had caused more damage than simply facing the truth together. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Patricia Mitchell, Ryan's mother. I know you have no reason to speak with me, but I need to tell you something about my son. It's important." Evelyn stared at the message, her heart racing. Patricia Mitchell had never contacted her directly, not even during the years when she and Ryan were together. For her to reach out now, on the same day Ryan had withdrawn his loan application, suggested something significant. She showed the message to Michael, who whistled low. "This day just keeps getting stranger. Should I respond?" "That depends. Do you want to understand what really happened 3 years ago, or do you want to maintain the narrative you've built to protect yourself?" It was a fair question. Understanding Ryan's motivations might explain his actions, but it wouldn't erase the pain he'd caused. It might even make things more complicated by forcing her to confront the possibility that the man she'd hated for 3 years wasn't the villain she'd made him out to be. But if there was one thing Evelyn had learned in her rise through the banking world, it was that making decisions based on incomplete information was a recipe for disaster. If she was going to put this chapter of her life to rest, she needed to understand the whole truth. She typed back, "I'll meet you for coffee tomorrow morning. Choose the place." The response came immediately. "Thank you. There's something you need to know about the conversation Ryan overheard the night before your wedding. Something that changed everything." Evelyn set down her phone and returned to her desk, where the Mitchell Enterprises loan application still lay spread across the surface. Tomorrow she would learn the final piece of the puzzle that had destroyed her engagement and shaped the last 3 years of her life. Tonight, she would try to reconcile the man she'd thought she knew with the one who'd just sacrificed his company's survival to spare her feelings. The numbers on the financial statements seemed to blur as she stared at them, no longer seeing profit margins and debt ratios, but the story of a man trying to prove he wasn't his father, even if it meant destroying everything he'd built. The tragic irony was that in running from one kind of failure, he'd embraced an even worse one. But perhaps the most tragic irony of all was that Evelyn was beginning to understand that the man who'd broken her heart might have done so not out of cruelty or selfishness, but out of a misguided attempt to save her from himself. Whether that understanding changed anything remained to be seen. Saturday morning found Evelyn driving through Queens in her BMW, following GPS directions to an address she'd memorized from Ryan's loan application. She'd canceled her meeting with Patricia Mitchell, deciding that understanding Ryan's mother's perspective could wait. There was something more urgent she needed to do first. The industrial district where Mitchell Enterprises had relocated was a far cry from the gleaming Manhattan towers, where successful tech companies usually made their homes. The building was modest, functional, surrounded by auto repair shops and small manufacturing businesses. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die quietly, without fanfare or media attention. She pulled into the parking lot and immediately spotted Ryan's silver Tesla near the loading dock. The trunk was open, and she could see him moving back and forth between the building and his car, carrying boxes with the methodical determination of someone trying to stay busy enough to avoid thinking. Evelyn sat in her car for several minutes, watching him work. He'd traded his expensive suit for jeans and a simple polo shirt, and the casual clothes somehow made him look younger, more like the college student she'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. His movements were efficient but heavy, each box loaded into his car representing another piece of his failed empire being dismantled. Taking a deep breath, she got out of her car and walked toward him. He didn't notice her approach until she was close enough to read the labels on the boxes he was carrying. Personal effects. R. Mitchell, CEO. Going somewhere? She asked. Ryan nearly dropped the box he was holding, his head snapping up to stare at her in shock. Evelyn, what are you doing here? You can't withdraw the application, she said without preamble. Your company employs 200 people. You can't let your guilt about the past destroy their futures. Ryan set down the box and leaned against his car, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I already did withdraw it. The paperwork was filed this morning. Then resubmit it. She crossed her arms, studying his face. This isn't about guilt, is it? This is about fear. You're still running away from difficult decisions. The accusation hit its mark. Ryan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw a flash of the old fire in his eyes. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Evelyn moved closer, close enough to see the dark circles under his eyes, the weight he'd lost, the toll that watching his company collapse had taken on him. Scarlett came to see me yesterday. She told me about your divorce, about why you really left me. Ryan's face went pale. She had no right to involve you in that. She had every right, Evelyn replied. Someone needed to tell me the truth, since you were too much of a coward to do it yourself 3 years ago. Fine, Ryan said, his voice rising for the first time since she'd arrived. You want the truth? The truth is that I was terrified of becoming my father. I was working 18-hour days, missing dinners, canceling plans because some business crisis always seemed more important than spending time with you. I could see myself turning into the kind of man who loves his company more than his family, and it scared the hell out of me. So you ran away. So I made the worst decision of my life, he corrected. I convinced myself that choosing passion over responsibility, choosing Scarlett over you, proved I wasn't becoming him. But all I really proved was that I was capable of hurting the woman I loved more than I ever thought possible. The admission hung between them in the afternoon air, heavy with regret and years of unspoken pain. Evelyn had waited 3 years to hear Ryan acknowledge what his abandonment had done to her, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself feeling something other than satisfaction. You're right, she said quietly. You became something worse than your father. He may have been emotionally distant, but at least he never abandoned his family entirely. Ryan flinched as if she'd struck him, but he didn't defend himself. I know. But you also became something else, she continued, her voice softening slightly. You became someone who puts employees before profits, who funds scholarships for kids who remind you of where you came from, who takes responsibility for other people's mistakes. The financial records don't lie, Ryan. Even as your company was failing, you were taking care of people. Ryan looked up at her, surprise replacing the resignation in his expression. You investigated the company's charitable giving? I investigated everything. The Mitchell Foundation, the medical expense payments, the employee assistance programs. You've been bleeding money for 2 years because you couldn't say no to people in need. Those people trusted me to take care of them. I wasn't going to abandon them the way I abandoned you. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Ryan had spent 3 years trying to prove he wasn't the kind of man who put business before people, even if it meant sacrificing his business entirely. It was a form of penance that had nearly destroyed everything he'd built. So what happens now? Evelyn asked. You pack up your office, declare bankruptcy, and let 200 people lose their jobs because you're too proud to accept help from your ex-fiancé? It's not about pride, Ryan replied. It's about recognizing that some mistakes can't be undone. I hurt you in ways that money can't fix. I don't have the right to ask for your help. You're not asking for my help, Evelyn said firmly. You're asking for a business loan based on your company's potential for recovery. Those are two completely different things. She moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at her with such love and now held nothing but regret. 3 years ago, you made a choice based on fear, she said. You were so afraid of becoming your father that you became someone worse. Are you going to let fear make this choice too? Ryan was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Around them, the sounds of the industrial district continued. Trucks rumbling past, machinery humming from nearby factories, the distant sound of workers heading home after their Saturday shifts. It was the kind of neighborhood where people worked hard for everything they had, where job security meant everything and unemployment could destroy a family. "What if I make the wrong decision again?" he asked finally. "Then we'll deal with the consequences," Evelyn replied. "But you can't make any decision at all if you're too afraid to try." She thought about the man she'd fallen in love with in college, the one who'd been willing to drop out of graduate school to start a company in their apartment, the one who'd worked 20-hour days to turn their shared vision into reality, the one who'd proposed to her with a ring he'd saved for 2 years to afford, not because he could afford the perfect ring, but because he couldn't afford to wait any longer to ask her to be his wife. "The Ryan I fell in love with was willing to take risks," she said. "He was willing to fight for what he believed in, even when the odds were against him. Maybe the question isn't whether you'll disappoint me. Maybe it's whether you'll disappoint yourself by playing it safe. Like this video if you believe in second chances, because what happens next will determine whether love can truly conquer fear." Ryan straightened up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw a glimmer of the determination that had once made him seem capable of conquering the world. "If I resubmit the application, if the loan gets approved, what then? Do we pretend the past 3 years never happened? Do we go back to being the people we were before I destroyed everything?" "We can't go back," Evelyn said honestly. "Too much has happened, too much has changed. But maybe we can go forward. Maybe we can figure out who we are now, instead of who we used to be. And if we can't, if the damage is too severe to repair, then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll know we didn't let fear make our decisions for us." Ryan looked at the boxes in his car, then at the building behind them where his employees were probably spending their weekend wondering if they'd have jobs on Monday. The choice in front of him was the same one he'd faced 3 years ago, just with different stakes. He could choose safety and certainty, accepting defeat and walking away from everything he'd built. Or he could choose courage and uncertainty, fighting for something that might not be salvageable but was definitely worth trying to save. "There's something else you should know," he said suddenly. "The night before our wedding, I overheard a conversation between my parents. My mother was crying, telling a friend that she'd wasted 30 years married to a man who loved his success more than his family. She said she'd spent our entire engagement watching me turn into my father, watching me make the same mistakes that had destroyed her marriage." The revelation hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Patricia Mitchell had watched her son repeat his father's patterns and had seen history preparing to repeat itself. No wonder Ryan had panicked. No wonder he'd made such a desperate, destructive choice. "She was wrong," Evelyn said softly. "You weren't becoming your father. You were just a young man under enormous pressure, trying to build a life worthy of the woman he loved. There's a difference between ambition and neglect, between working hard and abandoning your family. Is there? Because sitting here now, looking at what my ambition has cost me, I'm not so sure. Your ambition didn't cost you everything, Ryan. Your fear did. Your inability to trust that I would love you even if you weren't perfect, even if you made mistakes, even if you sometimes worked too late or missed dinner because of a business crisis." She reached out and touched his hand, the first physical contact they'd had in 3 years. His skin was warm, familiar, and for a moment she remembered what it felt like to believe in forever. "I would have understood," she said. "I would have helped you find balance. We could have figured it out together if you'd given us the chance." Ryan looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "I was so afraid of losing you gradually that I lost you completely instead." "Yes, you did. But that was then. The question now is what you're going to do with the wisdom you've gained from making such a spectacular mistake." Ryan was quiet for several long minutes, weighing her words against 3 years of regret and self-recrimination. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Lucas? It's Ryan. I need you to prepare a new loan application submission for Monday morning." "Yes, I know what I said yesterday. I changed my mind." He hung up and looked at Evelyn with something that might have been hope. "I'll resubmit the application. But I want you to know that whatever decision you make about the loan, I understand. You don't owe me anything, and I won't hold it against you if the answer is no." "Good," Evelyn replied. "Because the loan committee's decision will be based entirely on the company's financial prospects and recovery potential. Personal history won't factor into it. And us? Ryan asked quietly. Is there any possibility of an US? It was the question she'd been avoiding since walking into his office 3 days ago. The safe answer was no. The smart answer was no. The answer that protected her heart and preserved the life she'd built was definitely no. I don't know, she admitted. But I'm willing to find out. Ryan's smile was tentative but genuine. The first real smile she'd seen from him since their confrontation began. That's more than I deserve. Maybe it's not about deserving, Evelyn said. Maybe it's about recognizing what matters and being brave enough to choose it, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. As they stood in the parking lot of his failing company, surrounded by boxes that represented the end of one chapter and possibly the beginning of another, Evelyn realized that courage wasn't about making perfect decisions. It was about making honest ones, even when the stakes were impossibly high and the chances of success seemed impossibly small. Sometimes the greatest risk was refusing to take any risks at all. 6 weeks later, Evelyn sat in her office reviewing the quarterly compliance reports for Mitchell Enterprises. The loan had been approved by the committee 3 days after Ryan resubmitted his application, though not without intense scrutiny and strict oversight conditions. Now, looking at the numbers spread across her desk, she had to admit that Ryan's company was exceeding even her most optimistic projections. Revenue was up 18% from the previous quarter. Employee retention had improved dramatically once word spread that the company was financially stable again. Most importantly, Ryan had followed through on every commitment he'd made during the restructuring process. The man who'd once made promises he couldn't keep was now delivering results ahead of schedule. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Mrs. Cross, Mr. Mitchell is here for his weekly progress meeting. These meetings had become a routine over the past month and a half. What had started as mandatory loan compliance reviews had evolved into something more collaborative, though Evelyn was careful to maintain professional boundaries. Ryan would arrive with detailed financial reports and strategic updates, and they would spend an hour discussing the company's progress and challenges. Send him in, she replied, closing the compliance folder and straightening her blazer. Ryan entered carrying his usual leather portfolio and 2 cups of coffee from the shop downstairs. He'd started bringing her coffee 3 weeks ago, claiming it was more efficient than waiting for her assistant to fetch it during their meetings. Evelyn suspected there was more to it than efficiency, but she hadn't protested. Good morning, Mrs. Cross, he said, setting 1 cup on her desk before taking his usual seat across from her. The October numbers are even better than we projected. He opened his portfolio and spread out financial statements that told a story of remarkable recovery. Mitchell Enterprises was operating in the black for the first time in 2 years. The employee assistance programs that had nearly bankrupted the company were now being funded through a separate foundation that Ryan had established with his personal assets. Debt reduction is ahead of schedule, Evelyn noted, reviewing the reports. You've managed to renegotiate most of your vendor contracts and streamline operations without compromising quality. I'm impressed. The team deserves the credit. Lucas has been brilliant with the financial restructuring, and Jack negotiated settlements on the lawsuits that saved us millions. Turns out people work harder when they know their jobs are secure. There was something different about Ryan during these meetings. The desperate edge that had characterized their first encounter was gone, replaced by quiet confidence and genuine enthusiasm for his work. He spoke about his employees with obvious affection, sharing stories about their successes and challenges as if they were family members rather than corporate assets. Speaking of the team, Ryan continued, we're planning a company celebration next Friday to mark the turnaround. Nothing fancy, just dinner and drinks for everyone who stuck with us through the worst of it. I was wondering if you'd consider joining us. Evelyn looked up from the financial reports, surprised by the invitation. That's very kind, but I don't think it would be appropriate. The bank maintains professional relationships with borrowers, not personal ones. Of course, I understand. But there was something in his tone that suggested disappointment, and Evelyn found herself reconsidering. Over the past 6 weeks, their weekly meetings had become the highlight of her calendar. She looked forward to Ryan's stories about the company's progress, enjoyed their discussions about business strategy and market trends. Somewhere along the way, professional obligation had evolved into something that felt dangerously close to friendship. However, she added, I suppose the bank's senior management does occasionally attend client events when significant milestones are achieved. If you were to send a formal invitation through proper channels, I might be able to make an appearance. Ryan's smile was immediate and genuine. I'll have Lucas send over the details this afternoon. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on her office door. Michael entered without waiting for permission, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the serious expression that meant he had important news. Sorry to interrupt, he said, settling into the third chair at Evelyn's desk, but we need to discuss something that affects both of you. Evelyn frowned. Michael rarely involved himself in her professional affairs unless something significant was happening. What's going on? Patterson Industries has made an offer to acquire a controlling interest in Mitchell Enterprises, Michael said, sliding the envelope across the desk. The offer came through their legal team this morning. Ryan straightened in his chair, his relaxed demeanor instantly replaced by alert attention. We haven't solicited any acquisition offers. How did Patterson even know about our loan agreement? Word travels fast in the financial district, Michael replied. Patterson's offer is substantial. They're proposing to buy 70% of the company for $200 million, with guaranteed employment protection for all current staff and operational independence for management. Evelyn felt her stomach drop as she opened the envelope and reviewed the offer documents. Patterson Industries was known for aggressive acquisitions and ruthless efficiency. Their promises of employment protection rarely lasted longer than the first quarterly review. This is more than enough to pay off the bank loan immediately, she said, looking at Ryan. You could walk away debt-free with enough capital to start fresh anywhere you wanted. Or I could lose everything I've worked to rebuild, Ryan replied. Patterson doesn't exactly have a reputation for keeping promises about operational independence. Michael leaned forward. The offer has a 48-hour expiration date. They want a decision by Monday morning. For the next hour, they discussed the pros and cons of the Patterson offer. The financial benefits were undeniable. Ryan could pay off his debts, secure his employees' immediate futures, and walk away with enough money to retire comfortably or start a new venture. But the long-term implications were troubling. Patterson had a history of acquiring companies, stripping them of valuable assets, and then dismantling them when they were no longer profitable. What do you want to do? Evelyn asked finally. Ryan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office, and the city below hummed with its usual energy. From 42 floors up, the people and cars looked like pieces on a chessboard, each moving according to strategies and motivations invisible from this height. 3 years ago, I would have taken the money and run, he said finally. I would have convinced myself that $200 million was worth more than anything I was giving up. And now I've learned that some things are worth more than financial security. Trust, loyalty, building something that lasts longer than the next quarterly report. Ryan turned back to face them, and Evelyn saw determination in his eyes that reminded her of the young entrepreneur she'd fallen in love with years ago. I'm going to decline the offer, he said. Mitchell Enterprises isn't for sale. Michael raised his eyebrows. That's a lot of money to walk away from. It's not about the money. It's about proving that I've learned from my mistakes, that I can build something meaningful and stick with it, even when easier options present themselves. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest as she watched Ryan make his decision. This was the man she'd always hoped he could become. Someone who understood that true success wasn't measured only in dollars and cents, but in the lives touched and the legacy built. Actually, Ryan continued, pulling out his phone, I have a counter-proposal. Instead of selling to Patterson, I'd like to discuss a strategic partnership with First National. The bank could take a minority stake in the company in exchange for continued loan support and business development resources. Michael and Evelyn exchanged glances. Strategic partnerships between banks and their borrowers were rare, but not unprecedented. If structured correctly, such an arrangement could benefit both parties while maintaining the company's independence. That's an interesting proposal, Evelyn said carefully. It would require approval from the bank's board of directors and extensive due diligence. I understand, but I'd rather build something sustainable with partners I trust than take a quick payout from people who see my company as nothing more than assets to be harvested. As Michael prepared to leave with the partnership proposal to review, Ryan remained in his chair, seemingly lost in thought. The afternoon light from the windows cast patterns across his face, highlighting the changes that 6 weeks of successful leadership had brought. The desperate edge was gone, replaced by quiet confidence and genuine contentment. "You could have taken that money and started fresh anywhere," Evelyn said after Michael left. "Why choose the harder path?" "Because the harder path is the only one that leads where I want to go," Ryan replied. 3 years ago, I was so focused on avoiding my father's mistakes that I made worse ones. I chose the easy way out instead of doing the work required to become a better man. And now I understand that becoming the person you want to be requires making difficult choices consistently, not just when the stakes are low. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the city come alive as the business day wound down. Office lights began twinkling in buildings across Manhattan, each one representing someone working toward their own dreams and goals. "The company celebration next Friday," Ryan said suddenly. "There's something I should tell you about it. It's not just a celebration of the financial turnaround. It's also my way of apologizing to everyone who stuck with the company through the worst of it. People who trusted me even when I didn't deserve their trust. That's admirable. I was hoping you might understand something about forgiveness and second chances," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "About what it means when someone chooses to believe in you despite your past mistakes." The conversation had shifted from business to something much more personal, and Evelyn felt her carefully maintained professional boundaries beginning to blur. Over the past 6 weeks, their weekly meetings had become the highlight of her calendar. She'd found herself looking forward to Ryan's visits, enjoying their discussions about strategy and leadership, appreciating the man he was becoming. "Ryan," she said softly, "what we're doing here, these meetings, this partnership proposal. We need to be careful not to confuse professional collaboration with something else." "I'm not confused," he replied. "I know exactly what this is. It's two people who've learned from their mistakes, trying to build something better than what they had before. It's someone who broke everything he cared about, proving that he's capable of protecting what matters. And what matters? You. Us. The possibility that love can be stronger than fear if we're brave enough to choose it." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in its implications. Evelyn had spent 6 weeks watching Ryan rebuild his company and himself, had seen him make difficult choices consistently, had witnessed his growth from desperate supplicant to confident leader. "I'm not ready to make promises," she said finally. "Too much has happened, too much trust needs to be rebuilt. But I'm willing to see where this leads us." "That's all I can ask for," Ryan said, gathering his papers and preparing to leave. "That's more than I deserve." Maybe it's not about deserving. Maybe it's about recognizing what's worth fighting for and being brave enough to do the work required to earn it. As Ryan left her office, Evelyn remained at her desk, staring out at the city lights and contemplating the choices that had brought them to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she'd been reviewing a loan application from a desperate man whose company was collapsing. Tonight, she was considering a partnership proposal from someone who'd proven that people could change, that second chances could lead to something better than what came before. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and potential complications. But for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn found herself looking forward to the journey rather than fearing the destination. 3 months later, St. Patrick's Cathedral looked exactly as it had 3 years ago, but everything else had changed. The same Gothic arches soared toward heaven. The same stained glass windows cast colored light across the stone floors, and the same altar stood ready to witness vows of eternal commitment. But the woman preparing to walk down the aisle was not the same person who had waited in vain for a groom who never came. Evelyn stood in the bridal suite, adjusting the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Her dress was different this time, elegant but understated, chosen for its meaning rather than its price tag. The ivory silk was beautiful, but it didn't define her worth or her hopes for the future. She'd learned that happiness came from within, not from external circumstances or other people's promises. As she smoothed the fabric of her dress, her mind drifted back to the evening 2 months ago when everything had changed. Ryan had appeared at her apartment door on a rainy Thursday night, holding a single white rose and wearing an expression of nervous determination she hadn't seen since college. "I know this might seem presumptuous," he'd said, rain dripping from his hair, "but I have something I need to ask you, and I couldn't wait another day." She'd invited him in, her heart racing as he knelt down in her living room, not with a grand gesture or elaborate speech, but with simple, honest words. Evelyn, I know I broke your trust once, and I know that some people would say it's too soon, or that we should wait longer to be sure. But I've spent 3 years learning who I am without you, and the past 3 months remembering who I could be with you. I don't want to waste another day being afraid of the future when I could be building it with you instead. He'd pulled out a ring, not the elaborate diamond from before, but a simple band that somehow meant everything. Will you marry me? Not because we're trying to recapture what we lost, but because we want to create something new together. Her answer had been immediate, certain in a way that surprised them both. Yes. You look radiant, Jennifer said, pulling Evelyn back to the present as she smoothed an invisible wrinkle from Evelyn's sleeve. Her former maid of honor had flown in from Chicago, where she'd built a successful marketing consultancy. Are you nervous? Surprisingly, no. Evelyn replied, checking her reflection one final time. 3 years ago, I was terrified that something would go wrong. Today, I know that whatever happens, I'll be okay. The difference wasn't just philosophical. Over the past 3 months, as Mitchell Enterprises had continued its remarkable recovery and a strategic partnership with First National had been finalized, Evelyn and Ryan had rebuilt their relationship slowly and deliberately. They'd had difficult conversations about trust and forgiveness. They'd established boundaries and expectations. They'd learned to communicate about fears and insecurities instead of letting them fester in silence. Most importantly, they discovered that they genuinely liked the people they'd become during their years apart. Ryan's humility and commitment to his employees impressed her. Her strength and independence challenged him to be better. They were no longer the young couple who'd thought love conquered all, but mature adults who understood that love required work, patience, and continuous choice. 5 minutes, the wedding coordinator announced, peeking into the bridal suite. The groom is ready, and all guests are seated. Evelyn took a deep breath and gathered her small bouquet of white roses. The guest list this time was deliberately intimate, just 50 people who truly mattered to both of them. No society photographers, no reception designed to impress business contacts, no pressure to create a perfect fairy tale for public consumption. She walked to the sanctuary doors and paused, looking down the aisle she'd been meant to walk 3 years ago. Ryan stood at the altar in a simple black suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression serene but attentive. Michael stood beside him as best man, having graciously agreed to support the marriage he'd once tried to talk her out of. But it was the faces in the pews that made her smile. Lucas sat in the front row with his wife and young daughter, beaming with pride for the boss who'd become his friend. Jack was there with his family, no longer just legal counsel, but someone Ryan trusted with his most important decisions. Even Scarlett had come, radiant with her new husband, a pediatric surgeon who appreciated her intelligence as much as her beauty. The music began, and Evelyn started down the aisle with steady, confident steps. She wasn't walking toward a fantasy of perfection, but toward a man who'd proven himself worthy of a second chance through consistent actions rather than grand gestures. Every step carried her closer to a future they'd chosen together, eyes wide open to both its possibilities and its challenges. Ryan's expression when he saw her was everything she could have hoped for. Love, certainly, but also respect, gratitude, and determination. This wasn't a man swept away by passion, but someone making a deliberate choice to commit his life to hers. You came, he whispered as she reached the altar, a reference to the wedding that never happened. I promised I would, she replied softly. 3 years late, but I keep my promises. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They'd written their own vows, promising not perfection but honesty, not constant happiness but unwavering commitment to work through difficulties together. When Ryan slipped the ring onto her finger, Evelyn noticed his hands were steady, confident in his choice. I promise to trust you with my fears instead of letting them drive me away, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. I promise to choose you every day, especially on the days when it's difficult. I promise to believe in your capacity for growth instead of holding you prisoner to past mistakes, Evelyn replied. I promise to build something new with you instead of trying to recapture what we lost. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ryan's kiss was tender but sure, a seal on promises they both intended to keep. The congregation erupted in applause, but Evelyn barely heard it. In that moment, surrounded by people who loved them, she felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. The reception was held at a small restaurant in Little Italy, chosen because it was where they'd had their first date 15 years ago. The atmosphere was warm and intimate, filled with laughter and genuine celebration. Instead of a receiving line, Ryan and Evelyn moved freely among their guests, sharing stories and creating new memories. During dinner, Michael stood to offer a toast, raising his glass with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with public speaking. 3 years ago, he began, I watched my sister's heart break in ways I didn't know were possible. I was angry at Ryan for causing that pain, but I was also worried that Evelyn might never trust love again. He looked at the newlyweds, seated side by side at the head table. What I didn't understand then was that sometimes we have to lose something precious to truly appreciate its value. Sometimes we have to break before we can heal stronger than before. Ryan, you hurt my sister badly, but you've spent every day since then proving that people can change. Evelyn, you've shown that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but choosing to build something better from the pieces of what was broken. Michael raised his glass higher. To my sister and her husband, who proved that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that begin with once upon a second time. The toast drew laughter and applause, but Evelyn felt tears threatening. Michael's words captured something essential about their journey. They hadn't simply reunited. They'd created something entirely new from the foundation of hard-won wisdom and mutual respect. As the evening progressed, the restaurant's small dance floor filled with couples swaying to music provided by a jazz trio. When the band began playing The Way You Look Tonight, the song that was supposed to be their first dance 3 years ago, Ryan extended his hand to Evelyn. May I have this dance, Mrs. Mitchell? I thought you'd never ask, she replied, letting him lead her onto the floor. They moved together with easy familiarity, but there was something deeper now than the passionate attraction of their youth. This was the dance of two people who'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to love anyway. Any regrets? Ryan asked as they swayed to the familiar melody. Evelyn considered the question seriously. About the wedding? About us? About the path that brought us here? About any of it? I regret the pain we caused each other, she said honestly. I regret the time we lost, the trust we had to rebuild, the hard lessons we learned the difficult way. But I don't regret where we ended up. Even though we had to go through hell to get here. Especially because we had to go through hell to get here. The people who got married today are stronger, wiser, more capable of real love than the people who were supposed to get married 3 years ago. Ryan spun her gently, bringing her back into his arms with practiced ease. I used to think love was about finding someone who completed you. Now I think it's about finding someone who challenges you to complete yourself. Very philosophical for a tech CEO, Evelyn teased. I had a good teacher. A brilliant banking executive who showed me that true strength comes from vulnerability, that real power comes from knowing when to ask for help. Around them, the restaurant hummed with conversation and laughter. Lucas was telling animated stories about the company's turnaround to anyone who would listen. Jack was deep in conversation with Michael about some legal matter that seemed to fascinate them both. Scarlett and her husband were dancing nearby, lost in their own world of newfound happiness. Look around, Evelyn said softly. Everyone here has grown, changed, found their way to something better than where they started. Life has a way of working out if you're brave enough to let it, Ryan agreed. As the song ended, they remained on the dance floor, holding each other close and watching their friends and family celebrate around them. The restaurant's windows offered glimpses of Manhattan's twinkling lights, the city that had witnessed their separation and now blessed their reunion. What happens now? Evelyn asked. Where do we go from here? Wherever we want, Ryan replied. We've got the rest of our lives to figure it out together. Any specific plans? A few. The company's expansion into renewable energy technologies is going to require some innovative financing arrangements. I was hoping my brilliant wife might have some ideas about that. Working together again? Are you sure that's wise? I'm sure it's going to be challenging, rewarding, and probably the best adventure either of us has ever had. As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, Evelyn found herself standing by the restaurant's front window, looking out at the city where she'd built her career and found her strength. The lights stretched endlessly into the distance, each one representing someone's dreams, struggles, and hopes for tomorrow. Ryan joined her at the window, slipping his arm around her waist and following her gaze to the sparkling cityscape. "Beautiful night," he said. "Beautiful life," she corrected. "Even with all the messy parts? All the mistakes and pain and uncertainty. Especially with all the messy parts. Perfect would be boring. This is real. This is real," he agreed, pulling her closer. Outside, New York City hummed with its eternal energy, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously. Stories of love found and lost, dreams pursued and achieved, second chances seized and transformed into something extraordinary. And in a small restaurant in Little Italy, two people who'd learned that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding perfect love, but about imperfect people choosing to love perfectly, began the next chapter of their own remarkable tale. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility. There would be challenges, disagreements, moments of doubt and difficulty. But there would also be laughter, growth, shared triumphs, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. As they prepared to leave for their honeymoon in Tuscany, the trip they planned 3 years ago but never taken, Evelyn realized that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in the strangest packages. Ryan's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced her to discover her own strength. Their separation had been painful, but it had taught them both how to love with wisdom rather than just passion. Standing in the doorway of the restaurant, looking back at the place where they'd celebrated their new beginning, Evelyn understood that love wasn't about finding your other half. It was about becoming whole yourself, and then choosing to share that wholeness with someone else who'd done the same hard work of becoming. "Ready?" Ryan asked, offering his hand. "Ready," she replied, taking it without hesitation. Together, they stepped out into the New York night. Two people who'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin not with "once upon a time," but with "once upon a second chance." If this incredible story of second chances, forgiveness, and true love touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for love to find its way back. Don't forget to subscribe to Love Stories with Mr. Wilson and ring that notification bell, because we post these inspiring, heartwarming stories every single day, and you won't want to miss the next amazing journey that proves love always finds a way.